Phnom Penh, the man at the center of Cambodia's darkest machinery was neither a warlord nor a fanatic. He was a former math teacher, known for his orderliness and a quiet, polite smile. Under his command, S-21 became a place where forms mattered more than lives, and signatures sealed death. How does someone transform from grading homework to processing thousands of executions, night after night, without a flicker of doubt? When evil finds shelter in paperwork, conscience becomes obsolete. What happens when morality is outsourced and the one in charge never blinks? In the mid-1960s, Kang Kek-yew, known later as Duch, walked the corridors of a Phnom Penh classroom, chalk dust on his hands and a mathematics lesson on the board. He was precise, almost severe in the way he managed his students. Attendance was never just a list. It was a ledger, checked and rechecked. Homework returned with neat corrections in red ink, each mark calculated, each mistake noted. Colleagues described him as reserved but exacting, a man who found comfort in the steady logic of numbers and routines. He rarely raised his voice. Order was expected, and when it faltered, it was restored quietly, by tightening the rules, not by outbursts. His classroom ran like a small bureaucracy. Every lesson began and ended on time. Students were assigned tasks and monitored for progress, their performance tracked in notebooks that Duch kept with almost clerical care. He preferred systems over improvisation, and his authority rested not on charisma, but on the predictability of his methods. Those who excelled did so because they learned his patterns: precision, repetition, completion. Those who struggled found little sympathy, but no cruelty either, just a sense that the system mattered more than the individual. Outside the classroom, Duch's reputation for discipline spread among staff. He volunteered for administrative duties, organizing school events, maintaining records, and ensuring that rules were followed. The school principal often relied on him when a situation called for a steady hand. His satisfaction came not from inspiring students, but from running an efficient operation. Even in the chaos of the city's shifting politics, Duch clung to order as if it were a lifeline. For Duch, competence was identity. He measured his worth in the accuracy of his records, the neatness of his ledgers, the silence of his classroom. Empathy was secondary to efficiency. There was comfort in knowing that every problem had a solution, every task a procedure. Long before he entered the world of revolution and violence, Duch had already learned to separate feeling from function. In his mind, a perfect system was its own moral compass. In 1967, Duch made a decision that quietly rewrote the course of his life. He left the chalkboard behind and entered the shadows, answering a clandestine call from the Khmer Rouge. Recruitment was not a dramatic rupture, but an incremental step. A meeting, a whispered promise of purpose, an invitation to join the organization known as Angkar. His reputation for precision and order had not gone unnoticed. To Angkar, these were virtues, not quirks. They needed administrators who would not question, only execute. Duch fit their needs perfectly. His first assignments were not violent. They were administrative, filing, sorting, creating lists of suspected enemies, tracking the movement of cadres. He was handed ledgers instead of weapons, and he responded with the same diligence he had once reserved for attendance sheets. Each page was an opportunity to prove his worth. He cataloged names, dates, and affiliations, transforming raw suspicion into organized intelligence. The work was secret, but it was also strangely familiar. The comfort of hierarchy replaced the uncertainty of the outside world. There were rules to follow, forms to complete, procedures to respect. The organization valued efficiency above all else, and Duch delivered. Ledgers became his instrument of power. As the months passed, his sense of agency faded by degrees. The boundaries between right and wrong became less important than the boundaries between completed and incomplete tasks. He learned to accept the logic of the system. If a name appeared on a list, it belonged there. If a superior gave an order, it was not to be questioned. His own judgment was no longer needed, only his skill at making the machinery run. The moral weight of each decision shifted upward, toward Ankar, leaving him with the simple satisfaction of doing the job well. Completed work replaced moral reckoning. Contacts within Ankar grew closer, more regular. Duch was invited to meetings, trusted with sensitive assignments, and praised for his reliability. Each new responsibility felt like a promotion, not a compromise. The organization rewarded those who made the system more efficient, and Duch's identity fused with this new role. He was no longer just a teacher or a bureaucrat. He was a cadre, a trusted part of a larger machine. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible, but by the time he realized how far he had traveled, the old boundaries had vanished. Order was no longer a classroom virtue. It had become a revolutionary weapon. Cadre is what he became. Prisoners arrived at S-21 in battered trucks, their names already listed in a ledger before the gates even closed behind them. The first stop was a narrow office where guards logged each arrival by hand, date, group origin, and basic details, all entered into a thick register. There was no welcome, just the scratch of pen on paper and the sound of shackles. Each new entry erased a little more of the person who had stepped off the truck. Next came the biographical questionnaire, a multi-page form that demanded everything: full name, family members, date and place of birth, education, work history, even political affiliations. Prisoners, often trembling, recited answers while a clerk filled out the form. If a detail was missing or inconsistent, the process stalled. The goal was not understanding, but completion, a file that could be tracked, cross-referenced, and stored. Once the paperwork was in order, a guard handed the prisoner a placard with a number. The mugshot followed. 2 photographs, front and side, were taken against a bare wall. The number replaced the name. The camera's click was mechanical, repeated thousands of times. These photos, now pinned to yellowed files in museum archives, were the only trace left of most who passed through. With an identity reduced to a number, the prisoner's file moved to the next desk. A clerk attached the photo to the biographical form, stapled the pages together, and updated the master list. There were no questions about innocence or guilt, only whether the forms were filled out correctly. Each file joined the growing stacks that lined the walls, sorted by date and number, ready for the next phase. The final step in intake was the preparation of an initial interrogation report. This document summarized the biographical data and listed suspected crimes, real or imagined. A supervisor reviewed it for completeness, sometimes adding handwritten instructions for further questioning. Once approved, the file was stamped and moved to the interrogation team. In these first days, the system did not shout or threaten. It simply processed. Clerks and guards worked in silence, passing forms from hand to hand, ensuring that each new arrival became a case, not a person. The machinery ran smoothly, indifferent to the fate of those caught inside. What began with a name ended with a number, a photograph, and a file, ready for whatever came next. Stacks of ledgers lined the walls of S-21, their spines labeled in neat Khmer script, each volume a tally of arrivals, confessions, and deaths. Every page bore the marks of routine, names crossed out, numbers assigned, photographs stapled beside biographical details. A prisoner's fate was sealed not by a single act of violence, but by the slow, deliberate accumulation of paperwork. The act of recording became its own ritual. Guards pressed inked stamps onto forms, the sound echoing down the concrete hallways. Each stamp meant a process was complete. A confession extracted, an identity erased, an execution authorized. Duch demanded perfection in these records. A missing signature or a misfiled page could bring punishment, not for the sake of justice, but for the integrity of the system. Clerks double-checked the spelling of names, the accuracy of birth dates, the clarity of mugshots. The language of the documents stripped away the person behind each file. Victims became cases, enemies, or simply numbers. Their stories reduced to checkboxes and procedural notes. Euphemisms softened the reality. Questioning meant torture. Removal meant execution. The process did more than organize information. It insulated those involved from the consequences of their actions. When a confession was signed and stamped, it felt like an endpoint, a task finished. The reality behind the paperwork, the pain, the fear, the loss, remained outside the margins. This sense of procedural completion created a buffer, allowing staff to focus on the mechanics of their work instead of its meaning. If the documents were in order, the job was done and the next file could begin. Duch's own signature appears again and again in the archives, often in red or blue ink, sometimes accompanied by a rubber stamp. He authorized torture, approved confessions, and signed off on execution lists with the same measured handwriting. The paperwork did not just record death, it authorized it. In the logic of S-21, if a confession was documented, then the guilt was proven. If a file was stamped, then the killing was necessary. Authority flowed through ink and paper, turning violence into a matter of procedure. The ledgers at S-21 were more than records. They were shields. They allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty without ever confronting it directly. Each completed form was a small act of distancing, a way to move one step further from the human cost. In the world Duch built, evil did not shout or rage. It filled out forms, pressed stamps, and moved on to the next case. Authority at S-21 moved in a single unwavering direction, downward. At the top stood Sun Sen, the Khmer Rouge defense minister. His signature, written in quick, slanted Khmer, appeared on the most sensitive documents: orders for purges, approvals for executions, instructions for tightening security. Sun Sen rarely visited the prison in person. Instead, his directives arrived as memos, handwritten or typed, delivered by trusted intermediaries. These were not open to debate. Each memo passed through a strict chain, from Sun Sen to Duch, and then to the layers below, senior interrogators, clerks, guards. Every level had its own responsibilities, but no one ever questioned the orders or sent a memo back up the line. Dissent simply did not exist in the records. Duch's role was both gatekeeper and enforcer. He received Sun Sen's instructions and relayed them with absolute clarity. When Sun Sen demanded more confessions, Duch called meetings and set the pace. When lists of suspected traitors arrived from above, Duch divided the names among his staff, assigning interrogators and tracking progress. Each step was documented, initialed, and filed. If a question arose about procedure, the answer was always the same: follow the chain, do not improvise. The system was designed to prevent hesitation. Responsibility flowed downward, but accountability pointed upward, toward Sun Sen, toward Angkar, the organization. Every document moved along this invisible diagram. Intake forms, confession transcripts, execution lists all bore evidence of this structure. A completed confession, once signed by Duch, would be forwarded to Sun Sen for review. Sometimes Sun Sen added marginal notes, circling a name or underlining a phrase. These annotations returned with new instructions: interrogate further, execute, or transfer. Clerks handled the paperwork, but the decisions always traced back to the top. In the rare event that a form was incomplete or a signature missing, the file stalled until the error was corrected. The process was rigid by design, leaving no room for personal judgment. Within this hierarchy, everyone had a place and a purpose. Guards watched the cells. Interrogators extracted confessions. Clerks assembled files. And Duch oversaw the entire operation, answering only to Sun Sen. The absence of dissent in the archives is telling. No staff member ever challenged an order or questioned the legitimacy of a directive. The flow of authority was absolute, and the structure itself became a shield, allowing each participant to see themselves as a small part of something larger, their actions justified by the demands of those above. This was not just a system of paperwork, it was a system of moral insulation, built on the certainty that the next decision would always come from higher up the chain. Confessions at S21 were not just expected, they were demanded. Every prisoner, no matter their background or story, was pressured to produce a signed admission of guilt. The process was relentless, measured in files completed, not in truths uncovered. Duch, as chief, enforced this doctrine of efficiency. Staff understood that a confession was not an optional outcome but a requirement, and the pace of extraction mattered. If an interrogator failed to deliver, they risked becoming a prisoner themselves. The threat was clear. In a place where the machinery of suspicion turned inward, the line between employee and accused could vanish overnight. Reports show that in 1977 alone, over 6,000 confessions were processed at S21. There was no formal chart on the wall tallying daily targets, but the expectation hung heavy in the air. Each week, Duch convened meetings to review progress. Staff were questioned about incomplete files, delays, or confessions that failed to meet the standards set by Ankar. Interrogators learned quickly that the only safe position was to keep the paperwork moving. If a case stalled, the blame did not rise up the chain. It settled on the person closest to the failure. The pressure to produce was not always spoken aloud, but it was enforced through example. Guards and clerks who made mistakes disappeared from their posts, sometimes reappearing as prisoners. Efficiency became a survival skill. The doctrine was simple. If the file is stamped, the job is done. If it is not, someone will answer for it. This logic insulated conscience. The confession became a box to check, a metric of compliance. The content mattered less than the completion. Torture was not personal. It was a means to an administrative end. A phrase circulated among the staff, echoing in the concrete halls. Ankar decides, I document. Responsibility dissolved as it moved upward. Each person handled their task with the knowledge that the order came from above, and the consequences of failure were immediate and final. As one former guard later recalled, if you did not finish your cases, you would join them. In this way, quotas were enforced not by numbers, but by fear and routine. The system rewarded those who kept the files moving and punished those who hesitated. The act of confession, forced, fabricated, or real, became just another step in the chain. When every action is measured by completion and every mistake is a threat, obedience becomes a form of self-preservation. In the world Duch built, the paperwork was never just paperwork. It was the difference between survival and disappearance. Van Nath entered S21 in early 1978, hands bound, eyes searching for answers that never came. He was one of the few who would leave alive. The guards told him nothing. His name was replaced by a number, his story reduced to a set of forms. In the silence of his cell, he heard the cries of others, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp, always unanswered. Each morning, the sound of keys and boots signaled a new round of interrogations. Survival depended on silence, obedience, and luck. Van Nath's talent saved him. Duch needed portraits of Pol Pot, and Van Nath could paint. Instead of the torture room, he was led to a bare studio and ordered to work in silence. Even there, the fear never left. He watched guards drag prisoners past the door, faces swollen, eyes hollow. In his memoir, Van Nath wrote of Duch's visits, calm and polite, sometimes even smiling, as if overseeing an ordinary office. Duch would check the progress of a painting, offer a quiet word, and move on, never raising his voice, never showing anger. Van Nath recalled that he was ordinary, smiling like a teacher. But the smile never reached his eyes. The other survivors, fewer than a dozen, remembered the same composure. One described seeing Duch sign execution orders with steady hands, as if authorizing a delivery and not a death. Another guard later testified that Duch's instructions were always precise, his demeanor calm, even when approving torture. The routine was unbroken. Files were stamped, names erased, and the machinery kept running. To the staff, Duch was not a monster. He was efficient, focused, and unfailingly polite. To the prisoners, he was invisible until the moment a decision sealed their fate. Van Nath's paintings bear witness where words cannot. He painted the faces of the condemned, the hollow eyes, the bruised bodies. Each portrait is a small act of defiance against the bureaucracy that tried to erase them. Through his art, the victims reclaimed their humanity, if only for a moment, if only on canvas. In the studio, Van Nath saw that the greatest violence was not always in the screams, but in the quiet routine of men like Duch, who smiled as they turned lives into paperwork. The survivors remember the faces, the voices, the numbers. The files remember nothing. In S-21, memory was an act of resistance. Forensic psychologists who examined Duch after his arrest did not find evidence of psychopathy or clinical insanity. His demeanor, calm and polite and sometimes even smiling, confounded those who expected to find a monster. Instead, they found a man who described his role in precise, almost clinical terms. Duch spoke of procedures, responsibilities, and the need for accuracy. He rarely mentioned the suffering behind each file. When pressed about the horrors of S-21, he described them as necessary steps within a larger system, not as choices he made. This was not denial in the usual sense. It was something colder, a firewall built from habit and hierarchy. Experts called this state emotional shutdown. In the language of psychology, it is a form of dissociation. The mind creates distance between action and feeling. For Duch, overseeing torture and execution became a matter of record-keeping. He signed death warrants with the same measured hand he used for school ledgers years before. The smile that survivors remembered was not a sign of pleasure or cruelty. It was a mask, an expression of detachment that allowed him to function inside a system built on suffering. Duch's ability to compartmentalize was not unique among S-21 staff, but it was especially refined in him. He insisted on perfection in the paperwork, berated subordinates for errors, and demanded that every confession be complete. Yet he never spoke the names of those who died. He referred to them as cases or enemies, never as people. This language was not just bureaucratic, it was a shield. By reducing individuals to numbers and tasks, Duch insulated himself from the reality of what he was authorizing. Psychological evaluations submitted to the tribunal noted that Duch did not exhibit the traits of a sadist. He did not seek out violence for its own sake. Instead, he described his actions as obligations, tasks to be performed efficiently and without hesitation. The smile, the calm voice, the steady hands, these were not signs of comfort, but signs of emotional distance. Survivors and guards alike recalled this composure as chilling. One forensic report concluded that Duch's emotional shutdown was a learned response, shaped by years of obedience and the relentless demands of the organization. This firewall of detachment did not erase responsibility. It only made atrocity possible on a larger scale. By turning off empathy, Duch became the perfect administrator for a system that required cruelty without conscience. The mechanisms of dissociation and emotional shutdown allowed him to sign thousands of death warrants without blinking, convinced that he was simply doing his job. Kang Kek-yew, known as Duch, was arrested in May 1999 after years in hiding. His trial before the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia began on March 30, 2009, marking the first time a senior Khmer Rouge official faced charges for crimes against humanity. The courtroom filled with survivors, journalists, and lawyers. Duch sat quietly, listening as prosecutors read charges of torture, murder, extermination, and other inhuman acts committed at S21 from 1976 to 1979. The prosecution relied on a vast archive, more than 1 million pages of S21 documents, including intake logs, forced confessions, and execution lists. Many bore Duch's signature, sometimes in red, sometimes blue, always precise. Photographs annotated in his hand, and testimony from survivors, guards, and clerks described the prison's machinery and Duch's role as its chief engineer. Prosecutors quoted directly from the files. The files repeatedly stated, "I, Duch, have checked and approved," a phrase found on dozens of execution orders. The court heard how he trained interrogators, reviewed confessions for completeness, and reported to Sun Sen, the Khmer Rouge defense minister. Duch admitted responsibility for the deaths of at least 12,000 men, women, and children. He did not deny his role. Instead, he described himself as an agent of Angkar, carrying out orders with precision. He told the court that he executed orders with precision. He explained S21 procedures, how prisoners were processed, confessions extracted, executions recorded. He insisted he acted under threat, that refusal would have meant his own death. His words echoed the language of bureaucracy. He said he did his job too well. The defense argued Duch was a cog in a larger machine, compelled by fear and Angkar's absolute authority. They pointed to his cooperation with investigators, his willingness to admit facts, and his expressions of regret. The prosecution countered with evidence of initiative, how Duch improved prison efficiency, enforced strict record-keeping, and sometimes anticipated his superiors' demands. Witnesses recalled his insistence on accuracy, his corrections in the margins, his personal review of sensitive cases. Throughout, Duch remained composed, answering questions in the same measured tone he once used at S21. When survivor statements were read, he showed no visible reaction. The trial ran from March 2009 to July 2010, with dozens of witnesses and thousands of documents entered into evidence. In July 2010, the tribunal found Duch guilty of crimes against humanity and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, sentencing him to 35 years in prison, later reduced to 30 years for time served. The records that once insulated Duch from his actions now sealed his conviction. In the final judgment, the tribunal's language was careful and cold. Duch's admissions were weighed against the evidence, his signatures, his instructions, and the millions of pages that bore his mark. The verdict noted his cooperation, his confessions, and his apologies to the court. But the words that mattered most were not about sorrow for the dead. They were about regret for the process. Duch spoke of duty, of obedience, of the burden of carrying out orders. He expressed remorse for the machinery of S21, for the procedures that failed to protect even his own staff from execution. Yet, when pressed about the victims, his focus returned to the system, the paperwork, the methods, the rules he followed too well. The tribunal's sentencing opinion made this gap explicit. Judges acknowledged Duch's admissions and his willingness to describe the inner workings of S21, but they found his regret incomplete. The opinion cited his proactive efficiency, noting that he did not simply follow orders, he improved the system, enforced stricter record-keeping, and anticipated his superiors' needs. The judgment stated that the accused contributed to the functioning of S21 not by passive compliance but by initiative and zeal. This distinction mattered. Remorse for procedure is not the same as remorse for suffering. Duch's apologies circled around the machinery, rarely touching the reality of lives lost. He told the court that he was deeply sorry for the crimes committed at S-21 and that he was an agent of Ankar, compelled by fear and duty. The tribunal, in its final statement, underscored this limitation, that the accused's acknowledgement of responsibility remained bounded by his loyalty to the administrative system that enabled these crimes. For survivors and the families of the dead, this was not enough. The names in the ledgers, the faces in the photographs, the children erased from the records. These were not abstractions. They were lives ended by a process that Duch never truly condemned. The court's verdict did more than assign guilt. It exposed the emptiness of procedural regret. When evil is measured in completed forms and stamped confessions, remorse becomes another line in the file, another task to be checked off and put away. That procedural confession can be tidy, efficient, and devoid of compassion. It can be a way to close the book without feeling the weight of what was done. The danger lies in how ordinary administration can make horror ordinary. The most dangerous evil is routine, handled quietly, efficiently, and without question. Today, bureaucratic violence still hides behind forms and signatures, from detention centers to corporate boardrooms. Systems that demand obedience can turn ordinary people into instruments of harm, as S-21's records chillingly prove. The lesson endures. When rules replace conscience, humanity disappears in plain sight. Evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it clocks in and files paperwork. For those determined to recognize it, vigilance must start with the smallest, most ordinary acts. Join the conversation below.